Oh yes. So are we live now? Can we take down the current presentation? Awesome. Thank you very much. Well, good morning, everyone, or afternoon or evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Brandon Hunter, and I am a community-based engineer and scientist for the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice, and I'll be your moderator for this session. And it's a pleasure to have you all with us today. Thank you for joining the second day of the Siege Environmental Justice Symposium, and thanks for joining this particular session titled Climate Change, Disasters, and Environmental Justice. And so we have some really good talks prepared for you today from some very esteemed speakers. But before we get going, I want to lay out a couple of housekeeping items. And so the structure for this session, we have about an hour total for the talks, and then we have scheduled about 20 minutes for a collective Q&A session afterwards. And we have five great speakers today: Reginald McKinley, Dr. Mark Barnes, Dr. Terri Adams, Dr. Ceeon Smith, and Dr. John Cooper, who might be joining us later. And so I'll have each speaker introduce themselves, and then they could go directly into their talks. But before we start, I want to remind the speakers that we'll have about 12 minutes max for each of your talks, just to make sure that the last speakers on the program have enough time for their talks, and so that we have enough time for Q&A. So if we can aim for about 12 minutes, that would be great. And speakers a reminder to look in the private chat for notifications from either myself or IT for time warnings. And if that doesn't work, then I'll start to give a little hand signals or something to try to wrap up. But with that being said, we'll get into our first presentation, and I'll let Reginald McKinley introduce themselves and begin the presentation.
Well, hello everyone. My name is Reginald McKinley. I'm super grateful to be here and to be asked to pop in. And if you can hear me, just give me a thumbs up real quick. Yeah, everybody? Okay, cool. I am grateful to be part of this panel and to be part of this larger conversation around how do we adjust for climate change for specifically people of color and those that are the most impacted and deeply impacted by what's happening. So a little bit about me. I've been in public service and public work since 2000, local level, state level, federal level, starting in the state of Arizona, and then organizing since 2005 with the Genus 6, which was an occurrence in Louisiana and Georgia, and then with dealing with judicial justice and equity, and then SB 1070 in Arizona, which was dealing with immigration and such. So community engagement, I dealt with in large organizations in the private sector and social impact across sectors. What I care deeply about is how we navigate impact, climate change, and who we think about it impacts and who it moves and how that occurs. I'm going to quickly kind of go over what I care about and in specific areas. And so my areas of emphasis are on the impacts of climate change on desert populations, and the areas that interest me and where they intersect with coastal communities, specifically in the Delta region, swinging from super South Texas up to the Mississippi Delta region, and how those correlate. Specifics: I am working in the Antelope Valley currently, which is in Central California, where you'll have cities like Lancaster, Palmdale, and so these are desert populations that have a large number of people of color that are residents. And you also have a very interesting intersection of how solar companies, technological companies, interested in agricultural kind of settings. And you'll see, and from a lot of us, maybe if you saw the movie Nope, you'll recognize the area. So very similar to the movie Nope that just came out, that is the exact area that I'm working out of and working in. So I will specify, and if you saw that, it's very rural, a very interesting intersectional space, even though it's not horribly far from proper LA proper, Los Angeles proper. So I think specifically I'm working with these communities that are BIPOC and traditionally agricultural, and with the influx of solar, aviation, and tech, the area is experiencing adjustments to natural climate. You're seeing a heightened level of droughts. You're seeing a heightened level of wildfires. You're seeing a heightened level of intermittent flooding, which may seem, that they don't work in tandem, but we're finding that it's swinging right on up. So things we have to consider and we're dealing with right now are looking at floodplains and planning for floodplains, how people are insured and provision for, even beyond governmental agencies, uh, and then housing insecurity post occurrence, whether it be severe drought, severe intermittent flooding, or wildfires. And then what are the governance needs, whether that be local, state, regional, county level, and what are their roles and where do those intersect? Do they have any provisions in place? What to answer that specifically, there are not a lot of crossover in county to city governance around these topics a lot of times. And so we're finding that depending on who you call and when you call and who you speak to, that they're being instructed to go different places to fix the same problem. And that could be from one occurrence to the next. That can only be a matter of weeks or months apart. And so the processes are not exactly there to provision for people impacted by climate adjustment and what they're facing. Um, there are similarities with the Delta region in reference to flooding, um, and like usable water and secure water post flooding. And you also see similarities in other desert regions such as Arizona with the droughts and with the wildfires. So, and then you have the wildfires where you're seeing similarities similar to the larger Western United States. And so you're seeing it everywhere from kind of forest settings to desert settings. And I think more customarily what people think about is probably desert settings. For wildfires makes sense because heat and everything. You're also seeing this in heavily vegetated areas that are not dried up and drought impacted in that large way. So we're seeing some shifts in traditional ways that wildfires are spreading and the frequency and their spreading and their frequency and their consistency that is happening. And that is very, very alarming. They're trying to figure out and put their arms around. What I've seen, and specifically around best practices and recommendations, is that there is a lot of usage of social media in the forms of communicating what's next and what needs to happen. And more importantly, we're seeing some really interesting trends surrounding TikTok being used over Google search in reference to how to navigate a range of things, whether it be natural disasters, health, wellness, uh, fill in the blank. And we're seeing with Gen Z that the shift is going from where it might have been for us, looking at news media avenues, whether it be, you name them, whether local or national, to Google. We're now seeing that that is happening on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook. And so specifically TikTok. And so we want to really like narrow in on that and be aware of what communities receiving their information and how they're receiving their information and how digestible it is and how easily accessible it is, while simultaneously looking at the main source of communication during a natural disaster that we've noticed is that it's really happening on social media in reference to direct messaging, stories that are being shared, and posts that are being put on walls. And so that could be anywhere from Instagram to Facebook. And so really accounting for the necessity of the third part, which is accessibility to Wi-Fi during natural disasters. We've seen this firsthand with what's happening during the war in Ukraine, with Elon swinging in and throwing some uh, satellites over to the Ukrainian government to help them still keep Wi-Fi, which is the main way they're keeping communications kind of going during this whole moment. And so we're seeing that that might be valuable to have access to Wi-Fi from a satellite form, even if people's cell phone towers and such go down due to wildfires, droughts, flooding, and such. So they still communicate the way that they primarily communicate now, which is more so the calls and text. It's really happening over direct message, Instagram stories, or Facebook stories, and wall posts. Um, and so we really need to look at that. And the third and last thing that we need to look at is how do we adopt for solar and backup generators? We're finding that a lot of individuals don't have access to power and for large periods of time, large swaths of time. So it's even making it hard for recovery. And I think we spend a lot of time on mitigation, but we don't think about how impactful saving lives could be with recovery and then process if we had some form of generators. If we thought about solar power and other non-traditional ways of powering items or even keeping cell phones up, and also thinking about how Wi-Fi could positively impact how people communicate, which would have been valuable during Katrina and other occurrences, but we definitely have a model now that we can follow. So that's where I will stop. I just wanted to share my tidbit and then hear from the other great panelists. And then I'm open to communicating and doing a Q&A a little bit more if anybody has any questions. And my information will also be in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Reginald, for a great talk. I think it's very interesting how you talked about how desert populations and that how there's an intersection with that in like the Delta region. I thought that was very interesting. And also, for housekeeping, for our listeners and viewers, if you can type in any questions that you may have into the comments, we can revisit those at the end of our program. And so moving forward, we'll now go to Dr. Mark Barnes. I have him introduce himself and then go into his talk.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Appearing to you from Morgan State University here in Baltimore City. And I'm really glad to be here. I wanted to first thank Dr. Jacoby Wilson for inviting me to be a part of this very important conversation. I am actually in my ninth year here at Morgan State. I'm an associate professor in geography in the History, Geography, and Museum Studies Department. And before coming here, I was doing research at Rutgers on institutional decision-making around weather and also climate hazards and disasters, most specifically around transport. And as we know, with Hurricane Katrina, much of the disaster was due to the over-reliance on private transport in evacuation situations. And so, again, I brought that sort of focus and looking at, people, because much of the literature at that time was focused on impacts to non-animate objects like trains, buses, railways, and roads, and things of that sort. And so I wanted to understand, how people understand risk for the most part. So coming here to Morgan, I stepped in actually into sort of an empty situation or void. I am a standalone geographer at Morgan for several years. Geography was, again, providing service to the education program for licensure purposes. That may still hold true, but geography has grown by leaps and bounds since 2013. My focus is on, let me share my screen with you all for my presentation. Okay. Okay, can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Great. So, this notion of geographic education is incredibly important, regardless of where you are here in the United States or abroad. Really understanding, climate change vulnerability, resilience, and all of that. So, coming here, I asked several questions. First, my one question was, who's doing climate change? Because that's where my work was. And then also, who's doing GIS, Geographic Information Systems. And then that led me, to this question of, what is geographic education to a people? And some of you may kind of be familiar with even sort of this phrasing from Frederick Douglass, who asked the question, what to the American slave is your 4th of July? Because climate change and how it was being communicated and presented, and previously was looking at sort of this green movement, stewardship that actually left out Black peoples. And the idea of education, climate change education, even I was really focused on how does that look for people who are most impacted and disproportionately impacted, by floods, strong wind events, and so on and so forth. And that question around geographic education within the context of climate change led me and others here at the university to establish a university-wide work group, environmental work group, also the geospatial collaborative, and also much, much more. And so looking at the courses here, much of what I do is help our students, whom most are either directly or have been indirectly impacted, by these events, which then also has an impact on the institution itself. And thinking about 2005 and Dillard University and Xavier and also Southern and one or more other HBCUs, made me think about, after reading a Washington Post article, about saving our nation's treasures, or our national treasures, was focused on the Potomac and all of the memorials along the Potomac that were being or at risk of being threatened by sea level rise. And I asked the question, well, what about our other national treasures, which Morgan is affectionately known as, and other HBCUs that are impacted by and have been impacted by these sorts of events, right? And we can actually even count upwards of perhaps 13 more or so institutions that are in direct line of fire from sea level rise, like Hampton University, and also Norfolk State University, University of Maryland Eastern Shore, and many, many others, or indirectly when different systems or transportation systems, energy systems, and the like go down due to those impacts. And so what I've done is used these courses, moving away from the survey sort of format, if you will, and actually putting students out into communities. And here in the introduction to geography, what you're seeing here is a sort of a map of Morgan, and what students here have done, and you see the map here, went out and asked a real basic or simple question. What does this place mean to me, right? And they went around campus, and this is incredibly important when you think about just having knowledge, this sense of knowing about your community, right? Whether we're talking about the city, whether we're talking about coastal communities, rural communities, or even suburban communities. Many sort of overlook what's actually there or what's not there. And so at this time, students were using Morgan as a laboratory to get a sort of a deeper connection with different parts of the university, to have conversations about the politics surrounding certain places, or the economics. Right now, Morgan is going through unprecedented transformation, physical transformation and construction. Who gets to make those decisions, right? And who's left out of the decision-making sort of process? And that's incredibly important when we start thinking about many of the communities that, again, are disproportionately impacted, from which many of our students originate. The next slide looks at sort of introduction to geography 2.0. which actually was the result of the pandemic, whereby I had students go out into their own neighborhoods, right? Because of the shutdown of the university, they got to go out into their own neighborhoods and learn. However, they learned, how to see and use, again, the neighborhood as a textbook. And I invited colleagues, which you see here is one of my colleagues actually from English, who spoke to students about the writing that's on the wall. I also brought engineering professors and philosophy professors to kind of help students sort of read the text that's right there in their everyday lives, because again, it's about knowing not just where, but also the why of where. And then this course in physical geography, looks at sort of the historical, right? The historical sort of conditions of race, and then also racism with regards to natural or physical environments or geographies. And again, this course enabled students to take a much closer look at the places that they have visited, have seen on, a casual basis, but to give them such a more of a closer sort of in-depth look. And this was a course that the students created a map looking at the injustices around, in this case, just the Northeast of the United States, the Northeast region of the United States. And then my weather and climate course, many students do oftentimes focus on actual events that impacted them. And so one of the interesting things about this course, it relates to actually a human geography course that I taught, where I had education majors, and they actually did a report on heat and how the district, the school district of Baltimore City, had a much larger problem on its hands than previously imagined, which now has actually, we know many of our schools are ill-fitted with HVAC systems that don't work and the like. And then this final, and I'm wrapping this up in the interest of time, is the fact that having these courses lead students to actually go on their own, right? Because these are the persons who will go back to those communities, to their communities, and share the knowledge that they acquired while here at Morgan State University. And the Geographical Peoples Society is one such group that grew out of these courses. In 2019, they formalized the group. And right now, what you're seeing is their work looking at sort of recycling. And you might say, well, recycling isn't a big issue. However, the Geographical Peoples Society, otherwise known as GPS, they actually engage in other sort of efforts to bring about environmental awareness using geospatial technologies. So I'm going to leave it there. I think that's all I have. Yep, that's all I have. And I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Dr. Barnes, for a great talk. And I thought it was really interesting how you brought back the Frederick Douglass quote and then contextualized like what is geographic education. I think it's really great to definitely get students out into the community because we all know that's so important. So thank you. Next on our program, we'll go to Dr. Terri Adams. And I'll have her introduce herself and then go forth with her talk.
Okay, great. Thank you. So my name is Terri Adams. I first want to say that I'm really impressed with the work that both Reginald and Mark are doing. Fantastic work that you're doing for our communities. Really appreciate that. So I'm from Howard University. I'm a professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology. And I also serve as a deputy director for the NOAA Cooperative Science Center for Atmospheric Science and Meteorology. And I'm currently serving as associate dean for research for the graduate school. So, but my heart is in research and working with students and mentoring students. And I'm lucky that I work for a dean who allows me to do that as a part of my task with helping with the research center, the Noah Cooperative Science Center, NCAS, as well as working on other projects. But just in terms of what we were asked to share, what got or led us to the work that we do. And I think we have help with the slides. Not sure, or should I share my slides, Brandon? Okay.
Yes, we see it.
So I don't think this is going to work, but I had a little cute slideshow here. But basically, Hurricane Katrina, being mesmerized with the images that were on the screen that we all saw during that time, trying to figure out how in a nation that could send satellites out into space and put people on the moon, but we couldn't get the needed resources to folks right here in the United States without more than a few hours passing. That just really blew my mind as we saw Black and brown bodies just stranded for days on end. And so that really changed the trajectory of my career, really, where I just kind of plunged into doing what we refer to as disaster research. So we know that climate change is amplifying poverty. It's a multiplier for poverty, not just here in the United States, but across the globe. And so, it's vital that we consider, as this conference really centers, how climate change is impacting the most vulnerable folks in all society. And there are several impacts of climate change on vulnerable communities. It includes, causing climate refugees. It leads to food and water insecurity, insufficient access to clean drinking water and water irrigation systems. It endangers livelihoods, and it also causes air pollution, among many other things. It's vitally important that we center the discussions within the framework of how this impacts Black, Indigenous, people of color, because it is mainly impacting these communities. And we know that our communities have a long, long history of fighting against oppression, of dealing with having to be resilient. And we know that many Indigenous communities have methods and methodologies that they have used throughout time that can be helpful for helping us navigate this new terrain that we find ourselves in. As climate change doesn't become a distant issue, it is the issue of the day and will continue to be. So while there are a variety of different effects of climate change, as I just mentioned, one of the things that people often overlook are the effects of air pollution as well as heat. And so, I pose the question, what side effect of climate change kills more people than any severe weather event? And of course, it includes poor air quality as well as extreme heat. Poor air quality causes more deaths per year than any other major environmental hazard, and more people in the United States die as a result of extreme heat than any other severe weather event. And again, I don't think people are often cognizant of that. And so climate change impacts air quality, and poor air quality impacts climate change. And this picture right here shows just depicts a little, provides some information on how that happens. And I won't go into the science of it, but it's important to know that as we are operating and going about our days, the decisions that we make daily impact what's going to happen in the future as it relates to climate change. So again, these are two quotes that I think really epitomizes the importance of really understanding the impacts of heat and how it unequally impacts the urban poor, as well as how pollution currently poses an extreme health hazard for all people, but particularly the poor and the most vulnerable. So how can we better protect vulnerable communities? When I created this slide, it didn't look like this. Just want folks to know that. But unfortunately, as it's been uploaded in the system, hopefully you can get a sense of what I'm trying to convey here. But basically, I think it's important as we think about how do we protect vulnerable communities that we seek to make sure that we are equitably providing avenues for dispersion of effective mitigation and adaptation strategies, that we make sure that we are targeting communities that are most at risk, and that we're not just relying on the powers that be to do the right thing. And so, as advocates, we have to make sure that we are cognizant and always vigilant and watching what's going on. I think it's important to consider uh, adaptation strategies, as I mentioned before, from the indigenous communities. And there is a book by Joya Watson that really shines some interesting light on some of the um, ingenuity that societies around the world have developed. And this is an example of one, as you see here in this picture, is it basically a bridge of tree roots that is able to sustain severe weather, and it lasts for decades upon decades upon decades. So there's various adaptation and mitigation practices. I'm calling for ecosystem-based mitigation practices I think are important. Develop nature-based policies, institute sustainable community planning and design, and making sure that the communities that are most impacted, as I stated before, are actually at the table, and integrating natural features into the built environment for mitigation of risk and to facilitate resilience. Eco-based adaptation practices as it relates to heat, in terms of defense against heat, planting more trees and release water and keep temperatures low. Also increasing space for lakes and other water reserves to cool the temperatures down within the communities, cultivating green rooftops. Defense against poor air quality includes cultivating green or urban forest, as well as creating more spaces within urban environments. Other mitigation practices include installing reflective and light colored surfaces on roadways, rooftops, and buildings, as well as distributing indoor air pollution monitors, as well as wet scrubbers, and the variety of different potential mitigation strategies that can be employed to help reduce the risk for poor air quality. Best practices to watch, there's Cincinnati's doing some interesting work. You have Houston is also doing some interesting work. Baltimore is just starting to, and Washington, D.C. is pretty progressive. You have a lot of investment into sustainable practices. You have the Green Building Act that was enacted in 2006, which seeks to make sure that by, I believe this year, I forget the year and I don't want to state something, but that's not true. But basically, it's trying to make sure that even public housing units and public housing projects are led and enterprise green community certificate approved. There's also homeowners are given rewards for reserving storm water. There is a smart roof program that's in effect. And then there's this canopy restoration project where the city is pledged to plant over 8,000 trees throughout the city until the year 2032. And then the city also has, over the course of the last several years, instituted this practice where it actively reduces the number of parking spaces throughout the city, including on Howard's campus. And it also has increased the parking rates to kind of encourage people to take public transportation as opposed to just relying on our cars. So I also believe that, and I think mitigation, adaptation, and resilience practices are important, but I also think it's important that we consider really putting some teeth into our policies, that we think about the green criminological approach to things, where we are thinking about criminalizing acts that people take against the environment. I think it's fine to have policies, it's fine to put things in place, but we're at a critical moment in history now, and it's like if we don't take this serious, if we aren't really moving forward, then we're essentially moving backwards, and we're all at risk. I think we should call it by its rightful name, ecocide, which is basically the destruction of the environment by deliberate human action or inaction. We have 10 nations around the world who actually have instituted laws that are punishable, that are severe punishments that range from anywhere from 10 to up to 20 years. I'm not necessarily calling for that number of years for people who violate the laws or the corporations that violate the laws in this country, but I do think we need to put some teeth into the policies and again, make sure that people who are acting against the environment, that are endangering the lives of people, that have to pay for it essentially. So viable solutions to bring about equality or equity and justice are just kind of a quick review of some of the things that I just mentioned. Advocating for criminalizing crimes against the environment, push political figures or officials to update infrastructure to make sure that we are actively engaged in I'm sorry, just checking my time here, and proper mitigation and adaptation practices, supporting political candidates that actively back viable climate mitigation adaptation strategies, and educating the public, turning research into actionable adaptation and mitigation opportunities, and engaging the citizens in citizen science projects. I was going to quickly go overview project or set of projects that we're doing at Howard University, where we are engaged in collective, integrative citizen science work. We're reaching out to the communities. We are distributing air pollution monitors for both indoor and outdoor, and we are going to do an assessment of the level of risk that people are at, and provide information on how we can mitigate those risks. The outcomes are to heighten public awareness, provide education and mitigation examples and strategies, and to collect actionable data, again, not just for research purposes, but for to the ability to empower the community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adams, for a great talk. Yeah, thanks for reminding all of us that climate change is a poverty multiplier. It's not something that's just additive, but it multiplies all the other factors that are going on. And thanks for sharing some very impactful mitigation practices, and for personally educating me as to what the definition of ecocide is. So thank you. And then next, we will hear from Dr. Ceeon Smith.
Hello, thank you. It's an honor to be here. Absolutely impressed by and humbled by everyone's work. I will be mindful of time and try to get through. So I'll just, before the slides, how I got here, and then I'll answer the other questions as we walk through. Again, I'm Ceeon Smith. How did I get here? So personally, this is not where I plan to be. I was in Michigan August when Hurricane Katrina hit. I heard from all of my family members. I'm a native of New Orleans. I came from family insurance, and we had a plan. So I knew where everyone was supposed to go. We have our markers. I have a group of family. They go to Arkansas, a group that goes to central, two groups that go, one goes to central Louisiana, one goes to West Louisiana. So I knew where everyone was going. And my mother, Alabama. That's always been our family plan. Hadn't gotten a confirmation from my father's checkpoint in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and we were looking for him. The only thing that worked during that time to reach people via communications was text messages. My father wasn't a texter, and we lost touch with him. That's my brief how I got here. I am a FEMA trained responder, ESF 15. I'm also a Command and Joint Information Center FEMA trained responder. I led the Joint Information Center during the hurricane response to Hurricane Katrina. I was not in the city at that time. I left where I was and returned home. One of the things that we learned that speaks to why I am here, is that Hurricane Gustav and Ike that followed Katrina and Rita hit immediately central and northern parts of the state. And we started seeing that trend when we talk about climate change because of the erosion of our coastal areas in this country became a concern. Also during that time learned, and one of the reasons how I got here, communications is my area. When I left New Orleans to study communications at Howard University, I didn't think I would learn it this way. A couple of the things: one, text messaging or email. But when a disaster or threat damages your entire infrastructure, how do you then communicate, especially with people who don't have access? To Reginald, to Dr. Barnes's point a bit earlier, and why I'm here, not understanding how we communicate and not understanding our communities. In New Orleans, Louisiana, before Hurricane Katrina, if you were at the bus stop at 12:05 and you missed a bus, that's okay because one was coming at 12:07. New Orleans is, yes, a southern city, but very urban in its infrastructure. It is a city that is heavily reliant, it's a tourism city. Tourism city pays tourism wages. So many families in those cities are not only renters, but also I may have a part-time job at the Marriott. I may have another part-time job at the Superdome. And that's my living. I don't need a car because I can take a bus and drop my kids off at school, go back to that bus stop and get my bus to go to work. So it isn't uncommon. It isn't until my mother's generation, and that's common in New Orleans, that people actually drove. Our grandmothers, our aunts didn't drive. They didn't need to. They used public transportation. So that led to so many people being stranded. Okay, how I got here. The second part of that in examining risk, I think Dr. Barnes talked about it, and also Reginald mentioned it as well, talking about how we view and look at risk. And when you talk about an evacuation, for example, contraflow. Well, if I don't have a car, contraflow means nothing to me. So when I look at risk, I look at the social production of risk that led to those issues. It doesn't have to be as catastrophic as Katrina. A flooding rain event can be a catastrophe for a family that doesn't have access to transportation. A family where everybody's working a part-time job, and if I miss my hourly job, if I'm late to work, I can miss my job. After that, and standing up the Emergency Operations Center before I left the city of New Orleans, we had to stand up for the response to Hurricane Katrina in 2010. I got married on May 8th. I went on my honeymoon, came back and reported to the command center in Houma. A couple of things that reinforced what had not been learned in that 5-year period. And that was still not listening to our communities and understanding how to recognize risk and respond and create those systems to promote and nurture resiliency. So one quick example, during the BP oil spill, you have small communities from Alabama to Texas to Florida, as well as in Louisiana. And those communities supported those offshore workers, and they also supported the shrimpermen and oystermen in that area. Well, when you have a family that a mother, her daughters made their living serving po' boys, an oyster po' boy and a shrimp po' boy, and they made a very, very good living. So when you're responding to that risk that's now impacted their livelihood, the $5,000 or the $10,000 that FEMA gives them, but if I made $15,000 in a week selling my po' boys, my life's turned upside down. This one-time $10,000 isn't going to do anything for me. So fighting and working with the executives at BP and working with some other stakeholders in the community to get that family in the supply chain for BP, because a larger food company had been brought in to feed all the response workers, bringing that family into that multi-billion-dollar supply chain. And when within a year, that family, that mother and her 2 daughters expanded, and they had a second location. They now had a system in their family where they could have what we call now as resilience. Those things then led me to study risk and resilience, as my colleagues have talked about, from a communication standpoint, how we communicate, learning that it was not until after Hurricane Sandy that FEMA officially included in its response the use of social media. It was not until Hurricane Sandy that they started using and put in their standard operation and procedures for Joint Information Centers that they would use social media to communicate emergency disaster messages. I also began to look at the social production of risk. What are those things in our societies that produce these risk situations for communities, poor communities that don't have access? And I began first investigating, because that was my experience, how the federal government responds. And now I can kind of get into the slides and kind of go on and answer the other questions. Along this and studying, so I follow and my approach has been to look at our risk society, that we look at an event, but we don't look at the history behind that event. So what can go wrong? We know factually that disasters that will continue to happen, but we also know some other key things. Hurricane Ida in 2010 was just as catastrophic as the last island hurricane in 1856. That needs to be investigated. That means we have not looked at our society's production of risk for communities across this country. You can go to the next slide. We respond traditionally, right? And again, investigating our government's response in a very militaristic preparedness response, recovery, sometimes resilience. And that's how we have been responding to disasters and risk in our country. But the investigation, of course, needs to go beyond that. You can go on to the next slide. And I continue to investigate those. And Reginald, I pay a lot of attention to social media and how our government uses and the other entities use social media to communicate to our communities about risk. What we have found, yes, we may have this one template of how we respond, but if you look at the other side, this is how our communities are responding. They need the help, right? We can go on to the next slide. So resilience then becomes our huge challenge, because we first have to understand risk before resilience. And a lot of my practical experience, as well as work and research experience, I did a lot of research under a grant from the Department of the Navy after Hurricane Sandy, starting to investigate our communications methods. Resilience in general, and I look at it from, again, a societal, I follow Tierney and Beck a lot in this, those scholars, and a lot of their research when talking about resilience, and I overlay that in communication applications because I believe it informs then how we create our messages, our emergency disaster messages. When you have a resilient society or resilient community, that means that community can absorb the shock, can absorb that devastation, can absorb that emergency or that disaster in a way in which they can still continue to function. I am also here because my mother is still displaced from a year after Hurricane Ida because of the impact of COVID-19, because of other impacts, damages, roof supplies, shortages of workers. Her damages have not been able to even get to an inspector as late as April of this year. Okay, so that means that particular ecosystem is not resilient, because when you're resilient, you can still function and still operate, and that is those are the elements that our communities don't have. Next slide. My focus and my activity now, I'm looking at the next generation. And I have this quote here from George Washington Carver, what do we do with all these peanuts and sweet potatoes? He was facing a risk, right? As an educator, I have coined rearranged the classroom, because he took his colleagues and they went out into the communities and talked to those farmers to hear from them, to see, and then to match their scientific knowledge and take those applications and work with the community to then answer we had a national problem in our country at that time. And they were able to, led by George Washington Carver, answer that. And this good old soy chai tea latte, we're still beneficiaries of that. And I believe that approach is the approach to building resilience in our community. So I focus on the next generation, concluding my research, and I was actually at Arizona State University, and I was glad to hear you talk about the heat as a true risk factor. And in that area for my concentration, I'm now, as you saw, I'm at Grambling State University. I've returned to the state of Louisiana, and I'm a part of the HBCU Emergency Management Workforce Development Consortium that's actually led by Dr. Downer at Howard University's hospital. She and I met at a higher education FEMA conference, where we were two of the few people in the room that looked like us. During all of my FEMA training, leading a JIC, was the only person that looks like me. And we have been we work with several HBCUs. We also have at the table representatives from Homeland Security, from FEMA, from the EPA, from the Red Cross. And we are talking about how do we diversify FEMA and Homeland Security's workforce, but also how do we impact the policies, as Dr. Adams talked about, because the policies just have to change. So we have been able to work through our congressional leaders. We've been able to work with community leaders, and we have been able to have conversations with Homeland Security and FEMA on ways in which they can diversify their pipelines. We have a long way to go, but the conversations are being had. So my focus is on this next generation. I'm also very active in our FEMA 6 region in higher education, and bringing our HBCUs to that conversation. Again, I know the money that United States Navy, the U.S. Naval grant that I worked with my colleagues in the Department of Engineering when I was at Arizona State University, and the dollars granted for that research, there's no HBCU that receives grant awards at that amount. And that's one of the things that has to change. Certifications on our campuses is also a part of our work. And that means training our students so they can train their families on how to respond to emergencies, disasters, and risks. Understanding what that means, and also understanding that that they can have a very promising career on the front lines, but also as a decision maker. So those are my areas of concentration, and I'll be happy to answer any questions in our Q&A. And thank you again for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Smith, for another great talk, and for reminding us of what the importance of resilience is. I like the quote, like, what are we gonna do with all these peanuts and sweet potatoes? Y'all bringing back all the old quotes today. And thanks for reminding us of different ways, or more holistic or more equitable ways to view risk, and who should we be listening to recognize and assess those risks, and different responses to those risks. So thank you. And so we don't have Dr. Cooper with us today, and so that gives us about 20 minutes for Q&A. And so we'll jump into a couple of questions that were already pre-populated that a couple people asked before the session started, and then we'll start taking some questions from the chat. And so this question is for all the panelists. Not everybody has to respond, but feel free to if you would like. First question is, what solutions are available to bring equity and justice to the communities that are overburdened by climate change? Looking at it from both sides, so like, what preventative and remediative actions can legislators, planners, developers, and other professionals take to protect BIPOC and low wealth residents, particularly action that can be taken to increase equity in mitigation and adaptation.
Do we just hop in?
Yep.
All right. So I think I'm going to swing it a bit because there's a top layer of this, which is what is the role of government and governance in this, and then there's a base layer of this that I wanted to kind of highlight of local community, actual organizational build out and infrastructure. And so I think there's a specifically around how we as people of color navigate this conversation and navigate these understandings and navigate these definitions and navigate the impacts that are happening to us and on us. And then what do we do about that kind of internally? And how do we, what are our conversations happening so that there's a collective voice that then goes out and says, okay, these are the things we need. And you can list them in a very clear, like, here's a 10-step plan. There's reason, I'm saying it that way, of what we need and what we're requiring from you, whether that comes down to in order to get your vote, in order to help you push this through, in order to whatever that looks like. An example that I forgot to use during my presentation was there's an organization out of Ypsi, Michigan, where they're putting together an event called it's called POP, Pullover Prevention. And so they basically have free car repair, free meals, free vaccines. And so it's Pullover Prevention provides free car repair of lights, air, and fluids to prevent interactions with law enforcement. Also comes for free food, COVID vaccines, masks, supplies, all those things. And so I think what this harkens back to, and a lot of us know this who are Southern, this harkens back to like when we were really insulated and we made sure we took care of what we needed. So then at that point, we can swing back out and say, here's what you're going to provide. Here's how you fill the rest of the gaps. And here's how you really show up. Governance side, right? Governance side, I think there is a very big gap they have in what is currently happening and what they understand to be happening. And I think that gap is being filled in through conversations with academics and with researchers and with technology companies and with private sector coming forward and saying, here's what we're finding. And I think the government is struggling to connect the dots on what all the data they're getting from every sector. I don't think they're really able to figure out what all of this means together and what that then means about how they reallocate funds, resources, who they give it to, and in what immediate ways do they have impact. And I think if you talk to most governmental agencies, they cannot answer those 4 things. And so we're in a really interesting space where, for me, how long do you wait for them to fill that gap, right? While understanding there's an immediate gap to be filled, and what parts can we play in filling that gap? And so I do think there's an opportunity with technology. I'm currently working on AR experience, deals with wealth distribution that could be downloaded on your phone and then used to help solve larger problems and see what your role is and what your part is in it. While we also, because we can walk and chew gum, while we also say to them, hey, here's the fix, here's what we need you to do, and show up in these ways. Connect the dots, because at this point, they're not connecting them dots.
Yeah, thank you for that response. Can we get maybe another panelist to respond to that?
Sure, I will. That question made me think about a video that I show. So a short, maybe 15, 16-minute clip. It's titled Chicago Fights Extreme Urban Heat with Greener Ideas. It was broadcasted by PBS NewsHour. And that clip focuses on the heat wave of 1995 in Chicago. And what Chicago, the city of Chicago, had begun to implement in terms of mitigation and sort of adaptation practices. And much of the investments were made in downtown Chicago. And so in having the conversation with students here about what they saw, right? But what they didn't see, and that was the investment in the surrounding neighborhoods. I also, when I show those kinds of videos, I also tell students, hey, I want you to see who's speaking. And I'm going to ask you the question, do those people even vaguely or remotely look like you? And it's not something that they even consider or think about. And my guess is that's the same goes for, again, those in decision-making positions, right? And understanding risk and impact and all of that. And I say that to talk about sort of, again, with the mitigation and adaptation, we need to recognize that this is not a colorless society. That whole notion that, color no longer exists, that is crazy. That's hogwash. It does. And we can see visually and visualizing even the heat signatures in cities. The most intensive heat signatures are in Black neighborhoods because no investment had been made, or the investment that was made years and years ago certainly weren't in foliage or things like that, especially in older industrial manufacturing centers. And so there needs to be a recognition, one, that color does exist, to make things more equitable. And, leaders need to just be more conscientious that we all don't have the tools to communicate, right? However, there are still intelligences and knowledges that are in communities that will provide proper direction, just like that quote about again the potatoes, right? We know in these neighborhood communities, just ask the question and you'll get the answers.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think kind of what you're talking about is kind of making changes to increase equity. I think that's a good segue into another question that we have. And so it's more so speaking about like recovery efforts. And so we all know that a shift is needed of implementing recovery efforts. And I think even a couple of speakers spoke to it in their talks. But the question for the panelists is, what steps could be taken by different agencies or different programs to adopt a federal disaster and recovery effort that is more centered in equity and justice, like more fundamentally? Would anybody like to take a stab at that?
I think Dr. Smith could add some interesting comments to this if she's able to. But I think first, we need to make sure that we hold public officials, their feet to the fire in terms of making sure that the agencies have mandates to make sure that they are responding in a way where all people are equal, regardless of how much money you have in the bank. When Biden first entered the office, he put that mandate down for various agencies. I'm not sure if that's, if FEMA's following it or if some of the other agencies are, but I think we have to be vigilant and assured that they are engaged in practices that are equal, where they're treating people as equal citizens, as opposed to the haves are at the top of the food chain and the have-nots are at the bottom.
Thank you for that. Do we have Dr. Smith still with us? I know she was kind of in between a couple of things. Well, if not, can we get some more responses to this question about things that can be done to improve equity in disaster recovery responses? Oh, I think we.
Yeah, I apologize. I had a emergency call on campus.
Okay. No worries. I think I'm hearing the feedback. Does everybody else get feedback, or is it just me? Everybody else getting feedback? Dr. Smith, are you able to change your audio settings so we might decrease feedback? I'm still hearing it.
Do you still have two windows open? We only see one of you, but we were seeing two of you at one time. That could cause it too.
Yeah, that might be it.
That was it. I apologize. That was it. And
Okay.
I'm sorry. There
And
was a question for me.
yeah. So we had the question, and the people was asking for your response. So the question was, well, the context before the question was, we all know that a shift is needed in implementing recovery efforts.
Mhm.
And so, in your opinion, what steps could be taken to improve programs so that these federal disaster and recovery efforts can adopt a more fundamentally equity and justice framework?
A couple of things, and that is one, making sure that on the federal government, in the federal structure, and responding to emergencies, that disasters and risk, that those local and state emergency centers are staffed with people that are reflective of the communities that they're going to that the communities that they serve and the communities that they will be responding to. And that also means looking beyond the traditional, the forest fires in California gave birth to disaster response in this country. And we've continued that hiring of frontline workers, and there's not a problem with that. But as times have changed, the applicants, the criteria that we look for emergency disaster responders has to change. So we need to look for people who have more diverse backgrounds and capabilities to become a part of those emergency efforts, and they need to be also more local. One of the things that changed during Hurricane Katrina, there was a time when the federal government responded, people were only on the ground for 90 days. Well, from Hurricane Katrina to now, because of the level of devastation, disaster recovery takes more than 90 days. So having to pull people from all over, you're pulling people from other communities who don't understand the communities that they're responding to. So an effort should be focused locally. If our governor's offices, per the Stafford Act, if our governors are going to keep the control that they have, and that at the request of a local municipality to the governor, then the governor then sets the trigger for national response to the president, then that should mean that most of the staffing, the people who respond to a state's emergency management effort, should be local people. And we need to pull in specifically HBCUs, because of the areas that HBCUs are located in. If you put them on a FEMA map, researchers have already proven, as we've talked about, that most schools are in flood-prone areas, in disaster-prone areas. There's a lot of community information, emergency disaster information that rests at our universities. And I believe integrating them into our governor's offices of Homeland Security, especially because most of our HBCUs are in our most active FEMA regions, our faculty and research experts like we have on this line, as well as students, as well as community members, need to be a part of that pipeline in a decision-making role. And that's how you bring the diversity. That's how you bring the diversity of thought that then supports. And I heard someone mention, President Biden's initiative, including HBCUs in the various agencies framework. That's a way to do that.
Thank you for a very powerful response. I don't have anything to add to that. I don't know if anybody else wants to add to that. All right, I guess we're moving on to another question. How do we try to keep our, I guess different sectors accountable, whether it's government, nonprofit organizations, whether they're community-based or not, or these for-profit entities of exploiting in the context of disasters or recovery efforts? Because sometimes when there's money available, there's that money grab, and oftentimes it's hard enough to even get appropriate monies and funds to be even available in the first place. And when they are available, oftentimes it goes to the pockets of those who already have, and the people who need it don't see it. And so what can not just communities who are impacted, but what could we all do, as we're all part of, the EJ climate justice movements. What are the things that we can all do to try to mitigate these things from happening?
Mark, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I'm processing that because I'm going back through and I'm thinking about what had occurred in New Orleans, actually almost just weeks, almost literally weeks after the waters had receded, was the huge land grab around, again, disaster capitalism. I'm thinking about Hurricane Sandy, and also the sort of the insurance debacle. I'm thinking about all of those moments in disaster sort of crises that special interests took advantage of people's misfortune. And so the best thing I can think of, again, within all of those different contexts and those that will soon come for sure, is that, people need to vote, and people need to understand who they're voting for, and they have to really be truly educated about these issues. And that begins again with our public education system, which is truly still decades, a century behind than where the system actually needs to be. I think we need to hold those responsible for providing education. We need to like really say, hey, listen, this is really what we need, because and as I said, the whole survey format, for me, like these textbooks, and they're great, right? They give us concepts, they give us. However, there's nothing about learning about where you are to give you that sense of connection and sense of pride and spirit about where you are, where you call home, right? And once you have that, I think you put yourself, regardless of the situation you might find yourself in a better position, not only to help yourself, but also help, also others, because you can better empathize with them, right? You can better empathize, with their state of being. So, yeah, that's all I have.
If I could just jump in real quick,
Yeah.
I think Reginald wants to say something too, but just to piggyback on something Mark said, I think that I've talked to some young people who were educated, and they don't, they're thinking that voting doesn't matter, after the abortion rights were essentially abolished. It does matter. I think we're doing a poor job in educating our kids on the importance of voting and what does it mean when you're voting, and how legislation gets passed. I just want to double down on what he said about that. That's an important component, and I think as Dr. Smith brought up, and as well as Mark in your comments, that we have a record of things that did not work in the past. Adding to what Mark said, the distribution of funds during the COVID relief, the fact that you had millionaires getting funding that took away funding from the average Mary and Jane and Joe is unconscionable on a time like that. We know what hasn't worked. I think agencies should be tasked to develop plans of action so that they don't make the same mistakes again. And I'll step out and let Reginald speak.
I think that's perfect. And as Dr. Barnes and Dr. Adams have discussed, it's really around the knowing. So I'll just bring up two topics or 2 points. Legislative process is unknown to most people. You will really take millennials down. They just don't know how it works for kind of large swaths of them. I'm blessed enough that I was in public service at each level, so I understand the process, which then brings us to the necessity around what Dr. Smith was discussing, of having diverse individuals in a room that have intersectional knowledge. And so somehow facilitating hiring practices, consultancies across sectors that allow for that information to now be either brought back in or transported out is one thing that we need to really, really put emphasis on in a very direct, clear, big way. The second thing is making sure that along these same lines, that the legislation exists to disallow private sector from doing a lot of what Dr. Barnes brought up. That will be, and we've seen this during countless occurrences where insurance companies will get a forecast of what's coming in for a hurricane season, and they will start to strip insurances away. They will start to add extra clauses to insurance policies that then disallow you from collecting on the back end. And the government knows this, and they can legislate against it. They can say, hey, if you've covered insurance here for the last 10, 15 years in Homa or other places, if you've in wherever, fill in a blank, if you've covered it, then you got to cover it, right? You don't get to uncover it because the season looks like it's going to be more intense, and especially during the season. So we all know that the season is swinging up probably the next week or so, and it'll run for the next month and a half in a very pronounced way in the regions we're discussing. And so being very clear about how do we legislate for the best interest of the public versus legislating for the best interest of organizations, companies, or private. And then holding them accountable to my last point, which is there's a private sector requirement to fill the gap for public good and not for profit. And I think those are the things that we're not discussing in a very direct way. And we have to be able to say that directly. There is a private sector requirement to fill the gap for public good, not for profit. And if we don't say it in that clear of a direct way, we leave the wiggle space so that they can have social impact initiatives and other things that do a bit of it, and then allow them to keep functioning the way that the docs have brought up in multiple ways that is counter the forward movement of us adjusting for any of this. And that's what I'll share.
I was just going to add to that yes, education, and also talking and addressing directly the institutionalization of private and nonprofit organizations in the response process. The Red Cross is an institution inside of. So when a disaster is declared, not only profit, but also for outreach activities, the Red Cross is congressionally built in, and they're not doing it for free. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm just saying we have to talk about and unpack the organizations and the profit or the private organizations that are institutionalized in this response process. I'll go back to the lady and the food. There are food service companies that are built into our country's response system. They're built into that supply chain. And those are the things we have to address and start to address. If we want to build resilience in our communities, and again, back to the local representation and diversifying, right? We shouldn't have to call a larger company to come in and provide food. Do you know how many small business owners, how many restaurateurs should be built into those local supply chains to provide food? The resilience that then would build into those communities. A dry cleaner, he had a certificate in Homa. He knew how to remove hazardous waste and materials. Had to fight again to get him in that supply chain. He became a multimillionaire within less than 6 months.
Can I ask you a question, Dr. Smith?
Mm-hmm.
Is that process like an RFP from the agency or something to become part of that supply chain? Can you talk us through the process of making that happen?
Okay, so
and also you only have about like 30 seconds to respond to that.
There are a couple things that happen with that.
Yeah, I know.
There's a public part to that. Every local municipality, every government, you have emergency contracts and contracts that you can put in place to help you respond, that you can activate whenever a disaster happens. Right? There are funds available to do that, and that you get support for that through FEMA to do that. And so that's that contractual effort. Colleges and universities, nonprofits, For example, during COVID, when a disaster is declared, there are monies that are put aside and available for nonprofits to respond and help their communities. For example, I was at Benedict College during COVID. We opened a building that we didn't use to let the National Guard provide testing for COVID. Because we were a nonprofit, we were eligible to be reimbursed for use of the building, cleaning of the building, the parking lot, right? Those things, when a disaster strikes, it's called a post memorandum agreement. You can get reimbursed. So all of our churches, and I'm gonna tell you, with all my experience, I had to reach back years and get somebody to help me fight to get that done, because they were trying not to give that school the reimbursement for using their facilities for COVID. So now through the HBCU Emergency Management Consortium and being on conversations like this, we're now starting to talk about, there are some great people in FEMA, and there is a religious division, right, in FEMA that helps churches and organizations get in the pipeline, so that when a disaster or emergency is declared in their area, they know how to get public assistance, and they know that if they open their doors through the Stafford Act, they can get reimbursed for anything that they do to service and help that community. That helps to build nonprofits, churches, and even small businesses resilience, and to help those communities. I'm sorry,
Yeah, thank
Brandon,
you
I
for
tried to
that.
get that in.
Yeah. No worries, no worries. I mean, it's a lot of good information that we need. It's just I wish we had more time. But we are about a minute over. But one thing that I like to do when I moderate things is to ask the panelists for like a final, like 1-2 punch, like a 1-2 sentence summary, or like a call to action of whether summarizing your work or giving a gold nugget to the people. And so we're already over time. But if you could take like 30 seconds, like each person go over, but take about 30 seconds, and maybe take a couple seconds on the front end to think about what you want to say. Oh, I'm actually getting a message saying we can go over a couple of minutes, but we do still have to wrap up. So who would like to take it first? Who's first on the gold nugget list?
I'll start. I'll just start by encouraging people to really learn about the risks that your community, um, the risk associated with the communities that you live in. Learn about mitigation and adaptation strategies that could potentially help you and your neighbors, and really learn more about the politicians, local, federal, um, vote. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you.
I'll swing in next if in case anybody wants to go. So I think quickly it is trust that everything works in over time. So be very, very cautious that like the work that we're doing didn't happen, you know, in a small amount of time. It happened over a long period. So give yourself time and space to work on it. This is truly a marathon. So please rest, please relax, please breathe, form practices around self-care, because the truth is that we need you more now than ever, but we need you full, whole, and committed. We need rest in full of joy and gratitude. Uh, so self-care, please. Second thing would be there is really, really, really a lot that can be said about the opportunities that technology are offering to fill these gaps and to move us forward faster. So I hope that we're not missing the wave with metaverse. I hope we're not missing a wave with AR, VR. I hope we're not missing a wave with innovation in our community and outside of our community. I really hope that we're doubling down and trusting that what might seem foreign or new or trendy has really the space to shift all of this in a very big way very quickly. So trust that, lean in. This is not the cell phone. This is not the front of internet. This is way bigger than that. And if we trust that, we can really get somewhere quicker before gates start to close up while floodgates are wide open. So those are the two things I'll leave with. And thank you for having me. I've enjoyed this so much. I've learned a lot. And please connect with me offline, everybody.
Thank you. Dr. Barnes, Dr. Smith, about 30 seconds each.
Yeah, I'll be quick. Oh boy. Geography is important. Geography is important. And I'm just gonna kind of leave a resource. I think that folks should read if they haven't accessed this resource already. It's a book by Carolyn Finney, who's a cultural geographer. The title of the book is Black Faces, White Spaces, Reimagining the Relationship of African Americans to the Great Outdoors. That book was written, I guess, in response to the fact that our faces were not visible in sort of this green movement. And the more, and this goes back to sort of workforce issues that Dr. Smith spoke about. This goes to legislative matters that McKinley, Reginald McKinley, Professor McKinley, Dr. McKinley spoke about, as well as what Professor Adams has spoke about. Be visible. We have to strive to be more visible in these matters and these issues, and it's just not a white thing. And I think that's where we really have to focus on, because our communities again are disproportionately impacted, and I share that with students all the time, and I said you must care. Many of them focus on, again, Black Lives Matter, police brutality, and the like. And I'm like, hey, listen, hundreds of thousands of millions of people, Black people, have been impacted, and you are not mad about that. So I say invest in educating yourself and educating others, about the wonderful, great things that folks have done, like a Majora Carter, Robert Bullard, and so many others. We have a rich legacy. Even Carver was mentioned here. We have a rich legacy that does not get celebrated. So I just want to end with that. With regards to the environment.
Thank you very much, Dr. Smith. Final words.
I'll just end with all of those of us that are on the call, listening and participating. Those of us that have participated for the last 2 days, you have an ear to hear, so you bring something to this conversation. We know what to do with all the sweet potatoes and peanuts. That's a legacy that's been passed down to us. We know what to do. We have been an emergency response community our entire existence, right? So let's collaborate, let's communicate, let's share. That's how we continue to move forward. And when we come to the table, let's put all of our experiences on the table, because this particular sector has a lot to learn from our communities. So please be inspired by that, motivated by that. And again, we know what to do with the sweet potatoes and the peanuts. And to Dr. McKinley's point, let's not give up. Let's continue to communicate, collaborate, and share, and invest in our HBCUs, invest in our MSIs, because they know what to do with the potatoes and the sweet potatoes and the peanuts. And we're here to help them, empower them to be confident in this next generation. Thank you.
Very well said. Great words to close us out with. And so I want to thank all of our great speakers for great talks, great engaging conversation, lots of good info in responses to these questions. I want to thank all of those watching or listening, and definitely thank Dr. Jacoby Wilson and Siege for putting on our symposium. You can find more information about all of our speakers in the bio that was sent out. It has more than information, and definitely check out the the talk at 4 o'clock. So like in a minute. hopping on a different YouTube link. But that's all the time that we have. Thanks for tuning in, and hope you have a good rest of the day. Hope you have a good weekend. Hope you can join us for the talk at 4 o'clock, and hopefully you can join us tomorrow.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.